20 years after the publication of Marx's Capital, the Khazar Jews of Eastern Europe picked up the book. They truly believed in the rhetoric of communism and meticulously drafted plans for its implementation. Leninism thus emerged. The kingdom on earth is the ultimate dream of Judaism, repeatedly described in various Jewish texts. All accounts are strikingly similar. The world achieves universal peace, is filled with justice. The poor and weak are protected. The land is fertile. Resources are abundant, and humanity coexists harmoniously with nature. These descriptions bear no difference from communism. Therefore, we may conclude, Marx, born into a Jewish family, slightly reworked the Jewish concept of the earthly kingdom and incorporated it into the first volume of Capital. It is necessary here to trace the origin of the Khazar Jews. They originated from the Khazar Khanate, a dynasty established by Turkic peoples in the 6th century. The Khazar Khanate gradually grew powerful, and between the 7th and 9th centuries, it effectively controlled the vast territory from the Eastern European plains to the Caucasus, commanding the critical passages of the Steppe Silk Road. Its main enemies were twofold: the Islamic powers of the Middle East and the Catholic powers of Europe. The original faith of the Khazars was a bloodthirsty shamanism, but to resist the incursions of Islam and Catholicism, the Khazar nobility collectively converted to Judaism, inviting Jewish scholars fleeing the Middle East to spread the faith, organize trade caravans, build cities, and train a formidable cavalry. At the peak of its power, the Khazar Khanate was considered by Jews to be their earthly kingdom. After the 10th century, however, the Khazar Khanate's strength waned. In 968 CE, it fell to the invading Rus Empire. Most Khazar Jews migrated west into Eastern Europe, while a few moved eastward into China's Henan province, settling in the Kaifeng region. It is crucial to note that the Khazar Jews were ethnically Turkic and had no genealogical connection to the Middle Eastern Jews. By the late 19th century, communism spread among the Khazar Jewish communities of Eastern Europe, resonating profoundly with this group. They sought to replicate the Khazar Khanate's century-long glory through the communist model, elevating it to the ultimate faith of the Khazar Jews. They targeted the Russian Empire for implementation and installed Lenin as their frontline agent. After all, the great Khazar Khanate had fallen to the Rus Empire. Now, by acting upon Russia, the Khazar Jews exacted historical revenge. Lenin's maternal grandfather was a Khazar Jew, giving Lenin a quarter Khazar Jewish ancestry. The Khazar Jewish community provided the funding, manpower, and strategic planning, orchestrating the October Revolution, overthrowing Tsarist Russia, and formally establishing the Soviet regime. Next came the Khazar Jews' performance. Starting from zero, they established a wholly new socialist system. The core elements of Leninism are as follows. First, the nationalization of enterprises, with ownership and operation under the government. Modern Chinese readers are very familiar with this. Here, the Khazar Jews embedded a logical trap. The government's interest equates to the interest of the people. By having the government own and manage enterprises, capitalist exploitation is supposedly eliminated, and the populace can live well, yet government interests never equal the people's interests. The government is merely a small collective of bureaucrats, representing bureaucratic interests. Thus, state-owned enterprises equate to bureaucratic capitalism, which exploits the people without any moral restraint. Second, abolition of free trade and establishment of a rationing system, also familiar to modern China. All supplies are distributed by tickets. The bureaucratic class enjoys material privileges, while ordinary people starve and shiver in the cold. Third, dissolution of parliament and establishment of a party-led Soviet system, again familiar to Chinese readers. The party itself is an abstract concept. In reality, it equals the will of higher authorities. The party's will transcends law, morality, and humanity. To obey it, one must abandon human nature. Fourth, creation of secret police, spreading terror among the populace. Any arrest, trial, or execution requires only a word from the leadership. This procedure, of course, is well known in China and remains in operation to this day. Fifth, the economic planning model. Beginning in 1928, the Soviet Union implemented its first five-year plan, directing industrial development and allocating societal resources through the state. And this is a system even more familiar to modern China. Leninism, in the name of communism, operates in the reality of centralized authoritarianism. Leninism could never establish a true earthly kingdom. It can only give rise to a highly centralized, demonic regime that brings extreme suffering to the people. The state-owned enterprise system and commodity rationing, the first and second principles of Leninism, were designed to create a bureaucratic-capitalist structure, allowing bureaucrats to control the core resources of society. This laid the groundwork for bureaucratic centralization. The third principle, the party leads everything, is a further measure of centralization, establishing a regime in which top-level bureaucrats control all aspects of governance. These three measures together constitute a complete model of centralized authority. The fourth principle, the secret police system, ensures the enforcement of this model, capturing and executing any potential opposition to guarantee its long-term survival. The fifth principle, economic planning, controls all social activity, assigning each individual the role of a mere cog in the machine, exhausting them in endless labor, leaving no room for independent thought, and directing society entirely according to the bureaucratic elite's design. Even if real economic or technological progress fails to occur, the essential goal is to bind everyone into the plan, entrapping them in repetitive, ineffective work. Following this, Soviet Russia simultaneously supported both the Chinese Communist Party and the Kuomintang, the nationalists, instilling Leninist ideas in both parties and letting them fight each other to produce an even more toxic victor. At that time, China's Beiyang government refused to recognize the nascent Soviet regime, prompting Lenin to plot its overthrow by supporting pro-Soviet opposition forces in China. The Soviet regime prepared on two fronts. On one hand, it backed Li Dezhou and Chen Duxiu to establish the Chinese branch of the Russian Communist Party in 1921, creating the Chinese Communist Party. On the other hand, it collaborated with Sun Yat-sen to reorganize the nationalists in 1923. Thereafter, the Soviets allowed the two forces to contend freely. Although the nationalists initially gained the upper hand, its leader Chiang Kai-shek refused to submit to the Soviet Union, unwilling to become a vassal of the Soviet system, unwilling to be perpetually manipulated, and intolerant of serving as the Soviets' lifelong subordinate. After 1927, Chiang decisively severed ties with Soviet influence and stopped accepting economic aid. From that point, the Soviet Union fully devoted its support to the Chinese Communist Party, channeling all resources into its development and growth. Ultimately, the more toxic Communist Party emerged victorious in this struggle, beginning the full implementation of Leninism across China. China fully implemented Leninism, and did so in an enhanced, radicalized form. Because Lenin died young, the Soviet Union at that time had not yet established a systematic administrative framework. Subsequent Soviet leaders, such as Stalin and Khrushchev, showed little interest in fully implementing Leninism, each pursuing their own agendas. Only in China was Leninism executed in its entirety, and even then, it was taken to extreme heights. One of the primary institutional features of Chinese Leninism was the hierarchical division of the population, designating the lowest class and compelling all citizens to mercilessly struggle against it. Even parents and children were required to sever ties. Many later political campaigns in China essentially revolved around forcibly stratifying society and inciting people to violently persecute those in the lowest class, often culminating in their physical annihilation. This 3-decade-long system of class division and internal purges was a uniquely Chinese innovation. In contrast, Stalin briefly conducted internal purges between 1934 and 1937. But the Soviet Union never experienced a nationwide, continuous campaign of political terror. Only China maintained a pervasive atmosphere of political fear, mass struggle sessions, and nationwide mobilizations. Another pillar of Chinese Leninism was a fully state-owned economic system, strictly prohibiting private capital from participating in economic activity. In cities, all private enterprises, down to small shops and barber stores, were confiscated and nationalized. In rural areas, the government forcibly established so-called peasant communes and implemented collective production, another radical enhancement of Leninism unique to Red China. In the Soviet Union, by contrast, state ownership was far less comprehensive. While large industrial state enterprises existed, small urban businesses, private handicrafts, local commerce, and community services were not eradicated. Additionally, Red China established a party-led state in which the party's authority superseded all else. Judicial, legislative, administrative, and military powers were concentrated under the party committee. This model, with absolute party supremacy, differed markedly from the Soviet model. Stalin, despite his apparent centralization of power, had to contend with the Supreme Soviet, and in post-Soviet Russia, a strong parliamentary and electoral system was retained. Marx's hostility toward capital encountered institutional and cultural checks in the West, but in China, it became radicalized, closely tied to China's unique historical context. First, China lacked a capitalist tradition. Western capitalism gradually emerged within cities, commerce, and the bourgeoisie, accompanied by institutional forces such as the rule of law, contracts, and commercial credit, whereas China long existed under a agriculture-focused, commerce-suppressed feudal structure, with low social status for merchants and underdeveloped capital. As a result, when Marx's theories arrived, China had almost no mature capitalist experience to engage with them, making it easy to equate capital simplistically with oppression. Second, Chinese social psychology resonated with anti-wealth sentiment. The egalitarian traditions of agrarian civilization and hostility toward landlords and merchants made Marx's binary narrative of exploiter and exploited highly incendiary, which in revolutionary contexts evolved further into hatred of all wealthy individuals, intellectuals, and independent social classes. Third, political power fully exploited this hostility. The Chinese Communist Party transformed Marx's theory into a tool of legitimacy, concentrating social contradictions on capital and the bourgeoisie through campaigns like Eliminate the Capitalists and Smash the Landlords, Divide the Land, thereby mobilizing peasants and workers to support the revolution. In the long term, this ideology produced profound effects economically. Decades of planned economy thoroughly destroyed market mechanisms, treating capital as an enemy and causing prolonged stagnation of productivity. Culturally, anti-capitalist values solidified into deep-seated psychology, so that even after reform and opening up people benefited from the capitalist market, they often subconsciously assumed the rich equal to exploiters. Politically, even though contemporary China relies heavily on capital operations, official narratives still retain rhetoric critiquing uncontrolled expansion of capital, readily deployable to tighten control over businesses and individuals. When history reached this point, the Chinese people found themselves under a dual shackle, Confucianism overlaid with Leninism. The core doctrine of Confucianism grants rulers both worldly governance and authority over thought, while imposing extremely strict behavioral norms on the lower classes. The core doctrine of Leninism, meanwhile, centralizes all resources and power under the bureaucratic elite, executes opponents secretly, and binds every worker through a planned economy. Imagine the consequences when these two doctrines merge. The Chinese government thus wields boundless worldly governance and authority over thought, with power over every aspect of society. Citizens' minds and behaviors fall under governmental jurisdiction, and few dare to question it. The boundaries of government power have never been an issue in China, because this has been the norm since the Southern Song. Chinese people are long accustomed to it. Moreover, the government can legitimately control all resources: cash, land, minerals, water, and even human life, without authorization or accountability. A single word from a superior can overturn any decision made by subordinates without consequences. There is no mechanism for accountability. This is the result of Leninism's cancerous legacy that has never been purged. In the entirety of human history, no government has ever wielded such unchecked, unbounded, and unaccountable power as today's Chinese government. Meanwhile, Confucianism and Leninism bind the people's hands, feet, and minds. Confucian constraints are cultural, legitimizing the government's boundless authority. In other countries, governments must negotiate and contend to acquire power, but only in China can a government instantly gain any new authority it desires. Leninism represents an institutionalized shackle. Outside China, the fate of the Khazar Jews, in the historical trajectories of the Soviet Union and the United States, shaped their firm belief in communism and made them key players in global politics and media. Within the USSR's brutal political struggles, the Orthodox Christian Stalin ultimately emerged victorious, defeating Trotsky, a Khazar Jew originally designated by Lenin as his successor in 1934. Stalin launched the Great Purge within the party, killing over 600,000 party, governmental, and military cadres. The main internal enemies were the Khazar Jewish forces. This triggered a century-long exodus, with groups fleeing from various Soviet republics to New York and surrounding areas in the United States. This migration continued from 1934 until the USSR's collapse in 1991. Over 2 million Khazar Jews settled in New York and nearby regions, eventually forming a rising Jewish corporate power. By the early 21st century, the Khazar Jews have always maintained a steadfast belief in communism. They hold that the USSR ultimately fell not because of inherent flaws in the Leninist path they helped formulate, but because Stalin and subsequent leaders abandoned the Leninist line, failing to truly implement the system. Consequently, they acquired mass media, promoted communism, advanced far-left ideologies, and controlled elite educational institutions like Harvard, aiming to replicate and implement Leninist policies in the United States. At the same time, because Khazar Jews have no connection to Middle Eastern Orthodox Jews, they strongly oppose Israel's state-building efforts. In the armed struggle between Israel and Hamas, Jewish conglomerates controlled by Khazar Jews firmly sided with Hamas. Understanding the Khazar Jews helps explain the political polarization in the United States. Over the past 4 years, under puppet President Biden, the Khazar Jews have come astonishingly close to achieving their goals.